Next speaker is Dr. Richard Haines, who I'll introduce a little more formally here in a minute. But I should say that Dr. Haines really has a lot of expertise in this area, and he probably could give 2 or 3 different talks on this subject. I've given him a very difficult assignment in that I've asked him to really combine 2 fairly substantial areas into one talk. And he's going to be talking about UFO evidence from photographs and multiple aerial phenomena cases. So those are kind of 2 different aspects of the whole area. Richard Haines was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, which is my adopted hometown now. And he attended the University of Washington College of Engineering and Pacific Lutheran College in Tacoma, where he received his BA degree in 1960. He was awarded his MA and PhD from Michigan State University at East Lansing in 1962 and 1964, respectively, in the field of experimental psychology. After numerous astronautical, including Gemini, Apollo, Skylab, and the space station, and aeronautical, such as management of the joint FAA-NASA head-up display program, landing simulation research, and so forth, he was appointed chief of the Space Human Factors Office at NASA Ames from 1986 to 1988, where he directed research and development efforts of the AX-5 so-called hard EVA spacesuit, as well as habitability design research for Space Station Freedom and spacecraft window design. He retired from government service in 1988 and taught at San Jose State University as an associate professor of psychology while working part-time as a scientist in the Research Institute for Advanced Computer Science. From 1990 to 1991, he has provided consulting services to NASA in various laboratory activities related to supersonic wind tunnel automation redesign and Space Station Freedom to ground bandwidth image transmission reduction. His interest in the UFO phenomena spans over 20 years, with special interests, as I said, in sightings by pilots and analysis of photographic evidence and data on close encounters of the 4th kind. He claims that, quote, these 3 areas contain the type of data that will bring us to a successful discovery of the core nature of the phenomena, unquote. He recently founded and co-directs the joint USA-CIS Aerial Anomaly Federation. His professional biography and lists of published books may be found in Who's Who in America, Who's Who in California, and similar publications. His latest book is Project Delta, a study of multiple UFOs. I forgot to bring out my copy, but there are copies available out on the tables out there. So won't you welcome Dr. Richard Haines.
Thank you. Sounded like the ship was about to leave the port, didn't it? Well, I'm just delighted to be here, and I was in Minneapolis, St. Paul area once before, about 15 years ago, and it's just as pretty now as it was then. It's really nice to be back here, except for the ice on my windshield this morning. I do hope that some of you here are interested in the nuts and bolts aspect of ufology. I sometimes fear that our field has fallen victim to the former more than the latter. And as you may realize from hearing the presentations, there are 2 general ways of studying this subject of anomalous phenomena, such as UFO. The previous speaker has given you a beautiful example of one of the 2 ways, where you take a single case and you look at it rather exhaustively and you find everything you can about the phenomenon from it. The other way, of course, is more statistical in nature, where you look at the broad spectrum of symptoms, as a doctor would, and then try to diagnose the disease, the problem. And Jim McCampbell's presentation yesterday would be a good example of that, where he takes a constellation of events and then looks, what do they have in common? What draws them together? I'm going to do both today, and I've been asked, as you've just heard, to cover a lot of areas, so I want to move right along. And I'm going to begin with photographs. So if I could have the first slide. We're going to go through a number of slides, and I'm going to try to convince you that there is a wealth of good quality photographic evidence. Czechoslovakia. This photograph was taken by the director of the Andreev Observatory, who sent it to Dr. J. Allen Hynek, from whom I received this print. And there's no explanation for it. We don't have the exact date, unfortunately. It's about 1970s, I believe, early 70s. But it's a very interesting event, which you're going to see a very similar case in just a moment from the U.S. Navy. Next slide. Yungay, Peru. These photographs are coming from around the world. In this case, we have two discs. I will point out, generally they fly with the longitudinal axis horizontally. It's very unusual to get a photograph of one object, much less two. In this case, there were 4 separate exposures taken. Next slide. This should be an enlargement of that previous. Sun angles are consistent. Shadows, reflections are consistent. Next slide. In general, we find oblate spheroids with an axis of symmetry. If you take a line and bisect the image in one direction, you can do a mirror image, and you'll find a left for right symmetry, for instance. Now, this next case is very interesting. It involves the SST Concorde on one of its very early flights, before it was put into commercial operation. And here it is flying over France. It was on a flight, next slide please, to investigate the solar corona, basically the magnetic field of the sun. And to do that, you need to be in a total eclipse situation. So they picked a day where the moon was right in front of the sun, and they positioned the airplane with a lot of equipment, scientists, and so forth, at that point, and they started snapping their pictures. Well, you can actually see, with a little imagination, the field lines coming down and above here in this orientation. The sun is behind the moon right here. You see the stars of the dark sky background. Next slide, please. Well, there was a scientist on board by the name of Jean Begot. He was a French astrophysicist, and he was taking pictures of this whole affair. And this is one of his photographs he took through a special optical port. You see the Earth down below, it's dark. You see the sky glow at the horizon, the terminator there. And you see the dark sky above. You're over the Sahara Desert, flying east at a very high rate of speed, almost keeping up with the shadow. It extended the length of their observation. Well, Dr. Begot took the picture and continued to look out the picture, out the window, and he noticed this little spot of light in the sky. And so, thank you. Yes, right here. So he pointed this out to his colleagues, and they took, I believe, only one picture of it. Next slide, please. This is an enlargement of that little spot. And again, I'd like to point out the symmetrical nature. If you bisect the image this way, it's almost a left for right image. What you're going to see today are primarily reflecting phenomena. This happens to be an emitting phenomena. It seems to be giving off its own luminous energy, although we don't know what's underneath the plasma, perhaps. Well, anyway, the group of scientists on board the plane were a little worried because they knew the press was going to hear about it. They were going to be asked what it is. And so they got together and talked about what they should say, because they didn't know what it was. And so I'm paraphrasing a bit, but what they came to say was, this is possibly one of the Perseid meteor shower impacts. It was something coming in through the atmosphere and burning up, all right? Even though it was hovering there for quite some time. They failed to mention that. And then another scientist said to the press, this is published in a French newspaper, this is a phenomenon which has never happened before, which will never happen again, and is of no scientific interest. Well, I beg to differ with them. Au contraire. Next slide, please. We still don't know what it is. Tijuana, Brazil. That's where this photograph came from. And as you can see, it's been blown up so far. We're beginning to see grain structure in the film. I'm not going to go into the details of photographic analysis here. It's just that would take maybe a year of graduate classes to do that adequately. Again, look at the symmetry. I try to point that out in most of these pictures. Next slide. This is a map of Vancouver Island, British Columbia. I grew up right down in here. I heard about a case that took place in Campbell River, right here. A couple had been on holiday with their 16-month-old daughter, and they were driving up to her sister's house at the north end, right up in here. And on the way, they stopped at a provincial park to stretch their legs, let the dog run, so forth. Next slide. So they're about halfway up, and she has a Mamiya 35mm camera and takes a picture of her husband and little daughter beside a lake. Then she stands up, she said to me, turned around and saw this mountain. And this cloud on the top reminded her of a volcano. So she said to herself, I'm going to take a picture. It's kind of my personal volcano. And I'm going to prove to my husband I can do a good job of photography. He'd been kidding her she couldn't take a good picture. Well, as you can tell, she took a very good picture. And in fact, she captured something in the sky that nobody that day saw. It took 2 weeks for the prints to come back, and there it was on the print. It was circulated around the neighborhood for maybe a week. It went into a drawer, or actually a shoebox in the closet, and forgotten. And I saw the picture about 2 years later, got interested in it, and did some study on it. My hypothesis is it was a Frisbee. And the husband was playing a hoax, and he taped a little dome on the top and threw it up, and she took a bunch of pictures and submitted it, okay? Well, first of all, they may have made no money on this photograph. They waited 2 years. I have the original negs, and it's the only frame on the whole roll with this picture on it, so they did a pretty good job by chance, and so forth. Next slide, please. She said her narrative is that she's focusing on the tip of the mountain, and sure enough, that's where the mountain is, near the center of the frame. If I were going to do a hoax like this, I'd focus probably or aim it at the object itself, although that's inconclusive. That's maybe a very carefully contrived hoax. And so any photograph that you have for analysis is only as good as the photographer and their motives and training, the camera, the lens, the film, the processing, the story that surrounds it, on and on and on. No photograph can stand by itself. And as we enter the digital age of photography, it's going to be almost impossible to verify the legitimacy of a UFO photograph. Analog photography is hard enough when you're down in the film grain, but digital photography is almost impossible. I once said it is impossible, and somebody caught me on that, so I'm wavering a bit. Next slide. Well, here's a blow-up of it. It is opaque to the sun, I believe. I used microdensitometry and computer enhancement and lots of other techniques looking for a suspension thread, thinking it was a balloon supporting a model. I went out and bought a bunch of Frisbees. I'm pretty good at Frisbee now after this. I wrote to the American Frisbee Association, and I can tell you the world records and all this. Well, my wife loaned me one of these legs, little egg-shaped plastic containers that pantyhose come in. Spray painted it orange, glued it on the top of the Frisbee, and I tried to throw that Frisbee. And would you believe Frisbees don't fly if there's a little dome on the top like this? It loses the lift. The lift goes away. I couldn't make it go from here to the middle of the table. So if he could do that, he's a better man than I. I don't think that Frisbees will fly with that disc on there. Well, then I took photographs of my Frisbee. Again, that's the hypothesis. Into the lab, digitized the images, looked at reflection factors and all this stuff, and there's a lot of reasons it's not a Frisbee. Next slide, please. It really is. I don't believe it's a Frisbee. I don't want to belabor the point here. Sun angles are all adequate. The presence of the cloud in the field of view gives a wonderful calibration on brightness. And I will tell you this, that the reflection off the polished portion of the object exceeds the brightness of the cloud by about 1.5 log units, base 10. Next slide. Next slide, please. Here's another enlargement, kind of halfway frame size. So this brightness right here is consistent with polished, let's say, chrome reflecting sunshine. That doesn't mean it is chrome. It means it's just has the same reflection factor, much higher than cloud, which is well known. Next slide. Well, we come to Belgium. These slides were provided to me by an organization over there that has been looking at this case. You heard about this case yesterday, actually. Triangular shaped with reddish yellow lights at each corner, and then a more orangish red light centered in the bottom. Well, this is pretty close to the original exposure of the one frame that was taken by this gentleman with a 35 millimeter camera color film. Some very interesting things going on here. Next slide. Here's a computer enhancement done by the University of Belgium. I'm sorry, the Military Academy did this one, where they can kind of subtract a luminance effect to get down to the real hot spots, the real bright hot spots. And if this is a rigid object, and if these are lights attached rigidly to the corners, how do we explain a V, a little U-shaped V, a bent straight line, and a straight line? There's no geometry we can find of a rigid object in yaw, pitch, and roll that would explain those lights. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at some of the corner lights now, one at a time. Next slide. All right, I believe this is the lower left. In an image like this, the color doesn't mean anything, for those of you who are not familiar with the pseudo-color. But the computer can assign a color to what was once a gray, a level of gray. And since the human eye is so much more sensitive to color, it's helpful in pulling out minor details, fine details, such as this structure here in the sky background. Let's take another slide, please. That was linear. This is clearly a J with some very interesting boundary profile around it, which is hard to understand. Next slide. And we have a little more circular area. Well, this case has not been explained. It remains an unidentified aerial phenomena. That does not mean that it's from outer space necessarily. It means it hasn't been identified. And the Belgian government has gone on record. First of all, they were honest enough to open up the data right away, no cover-up, as far as we can tell. The military cooperated extensively, and the UFO research group, which is multidisciplinary, did a great job, not only using their own talents, but calling upon experts around the world. And that's the way this business ought to run. No classification, nothing to hide. The phenomenon is worldwide. Let's get on with it on a worldwide basis. Next slide, please. Well, the computer can also subtract and add, well, I should say subtract is a better word, background brightness, so that we can now see the outline of the object itself that was not visible in the original to the human eye. The information was there in the film, but you just couldn't see it. The computer helps you see it. And I just want to point out, it is symmetrical, and here's the axis here, so that if you flop this edge over, it matches up here. The tips here, if you want to call it a wing section, which I don't think it is. I don't think it's a lift, in other words. It's flat. It's flat. This is the rear end. My conjecture is that it's the central source is the source of anti-gravity, basically the support capability, and that what's going on at the corners is the attitude stabilization system, the ability to yaw, pitch, and roll in the angular dimension. Next slide, please. Saas-Fee, Switzerland. A professional photographer was out hiking one day with some friends and took this picture. He, first of all, heard a noise, I understand, up ahead of him on this trail, and he had a camera along. I guess over there photographers take their cameras on the holiday. And sure enough, something starts rising up and shows up here in the picture. Next slide, please. This is a lake in Argentina at fairly high altitude. And I point this out merely, it's an example of a luminous phenomena rather than a reflecting phenomena. And once again, it has an axis of symmetry, which is vertical. Computer enhancements show that the main body of the object right here seems to have something protruding or a tail-like structure, like a gaseous substance or plasma or something coming out of it, coming down. It was seen by many people. Photographed by an American, I believe. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is upstate New York, a famous Hudson Valley series of sightings some of you may be familiar with. Well, I don't know if thousands, but many hundreds of eyewitnesses over quite a period of time videotaped this, got stills, as you can see, and a lot of eyewitness capability. The skeptics came along and told us this was a formation of light planes flying in too close together at night. That's a marvelous flight, if they can do that. And the FAA should take their licenses away. I'm told that as the object flew along, it rotated slowly. And if airplanes can do that, that's remarkable. Multicolored points. As it flew over, it was rather large in size. People underneath it could not see the stars inside the circle, suggesting it was a solid body, and that these lights were along perhaps the perimeter. Next slide, please. Last slide for the series here. My friend Mike Swords gave me this slide, and I really like it because it kind of captures the way I do things. No matter how prepared you think you are, when you get out in the field, this sort of thing happens. Slide off, please. Let me turn to view graphs now. I'm going to turn now to multiple area phenomena. In other words, where two or more objects are seen at the same time and same place. Why is this important? I hope it's obvious that if it's hard to simulate one UFO, it's going to be harder to simulate 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And what I hope to convince you today is that something weird's going on. That our technology does not have the capability to do what has been happening in our skies for a long time. Now, many of you sitting here have already come to that conclusion. I realize that. Some of you have not, and I'm not here to convince you really of anything. You must come to your own conclusions. But let the data speak for itself. A couple working hypotheses just to get me started. On this personal study, about 2 years ago it began, I realized that no one had really taken a close look at this subject matter of multiple objects. And so I did. Started looking in the literature, seeing what I could find out about this subject. I don't think that time is going to change the flight dynamics. I suggest that the more objects there are in a group, the more likely they will fly in a geometrically precise formation. And again, I don't think that the number of objects in the group will change over the years, over time. Those are working hypotheses. Then I looked in a whole bunch of places, including published books, of course, and articles, magazine articles, databases, a lot of friends around the world contributed cases, and so forth. Just to give you an idea, what about computerized databases? There's a lot of them out there. And if any of you are interested, I can talk to you afterwards about this. Most of us who are doing serious work have our own, personal, and mine is called AirCat, since I specialize in pilot cases. But as you can see, there are a lot of foreign databases. There's American databases, a lot of cases. The UFO cat in Chicago, back in 1980, had 70,000. I don't know what the current value is, but I think it's like 130,000 cases. Here's some more. I mean, there's a lot of them out there. So computers are being used rather effectively. Okay. A couple databases just for photographs. Now, let me suggest that if we take a close look at technology, flight dynamic capability, propulsion, navigation, energy management, so forth, that if you plot some parameter here on this axis, that over time we're getting better and better. That generally we're flying faster, we're flying higher, we're carrying more passengers or more bombs, but nonetheless the curve is going up. Now if, and this is a big if, something happened in Roswell, New Mexico in 1947 that embodied an advanced technology, I would expect to see maybe a couple, 10 years later or whenever, our aerospace industry's taken that concept and capitalizing on it. This is the capitalistic curve here. I don't see that, frankly. And in fact, if you take a look at the book that was mentioned out here, Project Delta, I have actually published the world speed records, and it's this curve right here for air-breathing engines. All right. They always say that if you give a talk, tell the people and then what you're going to tell them, and then tell them, and then tell them what you told them. Well, this is what I'm going to told you. Here's the bottom line, that if you want to go away with any summary, here's the summary. What you're going to see is multiple objects. This is only two or more objects at the same time that can hover with fixed distances between them. So the skeptic says, ho-hum, balloons, tethered. Okay, maybe it is. Maybe a couple of these cases are balloons. Tethered together with cable. They used to do that with radar reflectors and so forth. However, number two, multiple objects that move linearly across the sky with fixed separation distances. Okay, the skeptic says, well, acrobatic planes can do that. They do that all the time. Sure, okay, so maybe a couple of these are acrobatic planes, except you'll notice that they're not ever with wings, or there's no cases with wings. So maybe these are airplanes without wings. Number three, move curvilinear with fixed separation distances. Now it's a little harder for the skeptic to explain that, although there are acrobatic teams, the Blue Angels can do a pretty good job of that. Well, I'll show you a couple cases that they can't do. Number four, very high accelerations from point to point, so fast that on video and 16 millimeter they actually disappear at one point and jump over and reappear a couple frames later in another part of the sky. Fragmentation into many objects. Well, the skeptic says this is a re-entering meteorite. Well, that's okay if it's coming kind of horizontally or down. What about going up? They don't do that. All right, sharp right angle turns, and Jim mentioned the dynamics of this. The physics of this is not only difficult on the occupants in terms of G-loading, which I know a little bit about, but more importantly, energy management. You need a tremendous amount of energy from some source to execute an inertial change, a direction change. Independence and or dependence of flight paths relative to each other, and you'll see a number of cases like that. And again, that's a difficult one to talk about without a lot of definition, and just bear with me on what is dependent and independent. Here's a couple more. Precise alternation of location on a linear or other geometric pattern. How many of you are pilots here? Do any of you fly? Good, all right. Then you realize how difficult it is to execute a formation change precisely and do it right the first time. Okay. It implies you know where you are in XYZ space, you know where the other point is, and you can go there and they can come here, for instance. That's what I mean, alternate back and forth, as you're going forward. If you're hovering, that's maybe a little easier with a good GPS system, which most light planes don't have. And many of the cases you'll see occurred long before navigation, INS were even developed. Now I start getting into the anthropomorphic terms like curiosity, playful, intelligent, communicative, and forgive me for that. That's kind of the way I have to communicate what I think is happening here. That there In the case of airplanes, for instance, which is just one class of sightings, the other is ground witnesses, the airplane seems to be the focus of attention of the phenomenon. It'll come and zoom around the airplane as it's flying along in some, maybe in orbit or beside, and then hop to another wing and so forth. Again, to me that's curiosity, or the airplane is the interest. Or playful behavior, almost like it's thumbing its nose at us or something like that. Clearly intelligent guidance and control is exhibited, as I hope you'll see very shortly here. And finally, a highly advanced physics seems implicated. Let's get into some cases here. This to me is a very interesting and important case that Phil Klass claimed was a meteor. It took place in Seattle, Washington years ago, 1968. And having grown up there, I pretty much know the geometry. In a nutshell, a private pilot was coming into land at Boeing Field one night. He's coming back from San Juan Islands. And as he approaches Elliott Bay from the north at about 2,000-3,000 feet, letting down, permission to land almost, he sees what he thinks is a flight of airplanes coming towards him from McCord Air Force Base. He thinks he's in trouble, that there's a squadron of jets about to hit him head on. The lowest object here down at the bottom was about at his altitude, so the rest were above. And he noticed that the uppermost object was the brightest. Well, he did a right angle bank, a high wing bank, and got out of their way, and they went zwishing off to his left side, to the north side of the city, and then stopped. As he continued his turn, he then saw them waiting up there over a place called Green Lake. And as he had a look a couple miles away from them, small white lights would arc out of some of them and fall to the ground. Okay. Anyway, so he was quite perplexed, but he had to land. So he just continued the turn and went on and came in for a short final and got permission to land from the tower. And at about 500 feet altitude above the ground, the air traffic controller called him and said, would you do us a favor? We've had a report of some lights out over Elliott Bay. Would you go take a look for us and see what you can see? Because another plane had come in from Tacoma, which is out to the west, to come into the Seattle area, and they'd seen these lights. And so he said sure, and he added power and so forth, and he looked off to his right-hand side, which would be basically northeast, and now saw these same oval-shaped white lights in an orientation like this, with the brightest in the middle. Somehow they had come to a new location and reoriented themselves quickly. Well, he adds power, as I said, and starts to climb out towards West Seattle. And now ahead of him in the night sky, there's no moon that night, he now sees these lights in the formation here, two diamonds, with the brightest at the top. Well, to make a long story short, the other pilot and his passenger saw this. He saw it, two guys in the tower. He has the tape recorder. His name is Rudy Malaspina, by the way. He has the audio tapes of the interchange that went on, which he claims the Air Force came and picked up from him and cut some sections out of and then returned a while later. It's interesting. How did they disappear? Which is a very important question in this business. He said they started disappearing from the bottom generally to the top, and as he kind of spiraled to gain altitude to get up near them, they kept going up higher and higher also, so he could never get up to their altitude. He said at the end of the sighting there was one light remaining, which was the top brightest light. It never went out. It just vertically climbed up into the heavens and became a star, essentially. I mean, when you're flying an airplane, you don't have much time to look at that level of detail. So there's one case with 9 objects. Here's a case in 1958, January 5th, involving 3 objects. And in this left-hand panel here, A, I've darkened one of the objects just to point out that what the dynamics of this case were, that they followed each other around a triangle. And so now this object that was here is now here, about to arrive at that corner. And they would stop at the corners like this, over and over again. Well, can you imagine doing that? How many of you have marched in a high school band or a college band and trying to figure out where the flag waves and all and where you're supposed to stand? Well, the ground is not moving there. Here you're in three-dimensional space. So you have to know where you are, where the corner is, how do you know to get to that corner just when the other ones know to get to their corners, and so forth and so on. It ain't easy. Interesting case from 1977. This occurred in the Midwest, I believe. A man was outside at night and he sees a bright white light coming in from the east at A, and it comes fairly close to him at B and stops. Just stops there, maybe at about 30, 40 degrees altitude in the sky. Next thing, another object comes in from the same direction roughly and swoops in and stops over the first object. He estimates about 400 feet above it, and the two just hover there for a bit. And then the first object slowly rises up to the position of B prime, and then at C, the two remain together and fly off into the distance, D. Two objects. 1963, September 14th, we have a cigar-shaped, some people like the word mothership. I think that's really big in question, and I don't like that concept. A larger phenomenon, let's say. And then a point-like source at A shows up, and as B slowly crosses the sky from left to right in the field of view, the small object A follows a very tortuous route, a random route. Now, random means it's random, and I have to draw a line, so this is my line, not its line. But it's approximate. On the average, the course is on an intersection course with the object, the big object here. And after a while, in fact, the two merge. Okay? And so A, which is the original source, ends up attached to or very close to or merged with or whatever you want to say, smished on the side of the object right here, and then it flies out of sight. A rendezvous, in other words. Next case I find very interesting because it is from the Air Force files, and it relates back to this Czechoslovak slide you saw earlier. It took place in 1954 off Bermuda, basically. A B-36 weather recon, I think was it 36? Doesn't matter. It's in the book. Nonetheless, a highly trained radar guy was on board, a highly trained crew, and their job was to map the weather for the naval operations going on. This is a standard operating procedure. And so they use the radar and visual and so forth, and they integrate weather sighting. The radar operator saw something on his scope that he brought to the attention of the captain and so forth, which was very, very strange. And it was a series of returns from the surface of the earth, surface of the ocean, or near it. He doesn't know the altitude. And the shape isn't important because you don't get good shape information off of radar. But there was something there. And I want to tell you something about what these returns look like. So he started his camera. It was so important. I had a little camera there to record the images off the screen, and I'm so glad he did. So this is the frame number from the camera. And in the Air Force file, they don't have all of them. They have these numbers, and you see they skipped some. This is the universal time here, Greenwich Mean Time. This is the number of seconds calculated from this to the previous one. This is the number of objects that show up on the screen. So originally there's 6 objects, or 6 returns I should say, I'm sorry. 43 seconds, there's 7. 19 seconds later after that one, there's 6. 58 seconds after this one, there's 7. 113 seconds later, 2 minutes later, there's 8. And then 9 minutes later, there's 7. There's quite a discontinuity in there. 13 minutes total radar duration. Well, here's fundamentally what they look like on the face of the scope. I measured the centroid distances, blew them up and digitized them and all that, and measured. This is the dimensionless numbers separating them for each of the frames, and they're quite consistent. Meaning that as this airplane's flying along, the radar is depressed about 20 degrees to get down to the surface at their altitude. They're picking up a number of interesting returns. And they're maintaining a spatial separation which is quite constant over time. Here's what they look like. Here's the first frame. So there's one missing here. What did I say? 47 seconds later, something shows up. Well, would you like to know what the Navy said this was? The Navy said, this is an explained case. This is not explained at all, and it represents a flotilla of ships coming in from the Mediterranean after an exercise there. And there were some destroyers, destroyer escorts, and a submarine. Well, easily explained. That's just a submarine popping up right there. Okay, wonderful. Except, when you read the record carefully, you find out that the radar man had, I don't know how many thousands of hours of experience and seeing all kinds of things on radar, and he says he's never seen anything like this. He said that the length of the return on his scope would be equivalent to from 1,000 to 3,000 feet. I don't know any ship that is that long back in this 54. Well, maybe a battleship, maybe the largest aircraft carrier. There were no aircraft carriers mentioned. And I don't think that the submarine can surface and then go back down again that fast. Maybe it can. Maybe somebody can straighten me out on that. Let's go back to the times again. I think that's important. Here's the times. Okay. So this is number 2, where there's 7 objects, 43 seconds after this. 19 seconds later, one of them disappears. This one goes away. 58 seconds, they're all back again. 113 seconds, a new one comes in here. And then 9 minutes later, they're back to this formation right here. I find this very, very interesting. The general formation, if you take the middle one out, that's precisely what happened in Czechoslovakia. It's the same separation distances, the same orientation. Let's just call it formation in general. Very provocative, and the Air Force Blue Book files kept it in. I mean, I think they felt that they were covered on this issue, and so they just left it in. I include that citing for you from the standpoint of encouraging you that there's a lot of data out there that you yourself can get into and do your own analyses of. And I'll tell you, it's fun. You get to be a detective. And you learn a lot in the process. Now, let me turn to the larger subject of multiple objects. Most people will write on this subject chronologically, so they present the cases in the date in which they occurred. Well, I don't think you learn too much from that, very frankly. So I said, well, I'm going to adopt a different approach. And I'm going to take all the cases I find and put them into one of 17 categories. And those categories are flight dynamics, the way in which the objects seem to fly. So the first category is straight and constant flight. No big deal. Not very much information there, really, except when you see some of the cases in just a moment. Well, I found 37 cases like that. This is not an exhaustive study. These are cases of interest to me. I thought they were potentially important, and there are many, many more. But I think there are enough to make points that need to be made. Category 2, straight flight path with or without sharp turns in 1 or 2 planes, 3 cases, and so forth. The first 13 categories are all witnesses on the ground. In other words, they're a pretty stable vantage point. However, I had so many good cases from pilots flying airplanes that I added this group down here where there's a constantly changing vantage point, and it makes the interpretation much more difficult, of course. But nonetheless, very valuable, I think. So these are the categories. I'll point out that the minimum sighting duration, well, I didn't calculate it here. It's 0.1 minute, okay? Maximum, what is it, 210 minutes? 360 minutes, right here. That's a long time. But the average was 18.9 minutes. Almost 20 minutes a person has time to view these multiple objects and to learn something about them. Put them into memory, draw pictures, grab a photograph, a camera, and so forth. That's a long time. They're not fleeting impressions. And with an average like this, it immediately excludes some prosaic explanations, like meteors. Meteors don't last that long, and so forth. So there's 230 cases representing 100%. The number of objects, there's a lot of objects here, and as Dr. Haines liked to say, we have an embarrassment of riches. I think that he said, didn't he? Yeah. That we have a lot of things to explain. It isn't just one or two cases, it's an awful lot. In this case, these 230 cases involve 1,779 objects, whatever they are. That's a lot. Well, let me get into some multiple cases in just a moment. How are they distributed by date? Well, this gives you some idea of that. I have a couple cases back to back in the BCs, as you can see. It's historical, there's no doubt about that. And I was going to read you a couple, but I don't think I will now. But if you read the literature going back this far, as Eddie Bullard and many others have, you find that the words flying saucer is very new, and you have to be more open-minded as to what words are used to describe the phenomenon. Case in point, my earliest pilot case involving UFOs is by Alberto Costa, who was a stunt flyer. And in 1927, he said, he was flying an open cockpit Belanca in the Midwest, somewhere near here, I think, maybe Ohio. Clear sunny day, minding his own business, practicing acrobatics, and alongside his airplane come, I think he said, 4 manhole covers in formation, manhole covers. Well, that's wonderful. No flying saucers, he didn't know what they were, so he just described what he saw, and he was honest enough to do that. Well, he got some ribbing, of course, like what you've been drinking and so forth. But nonetheless, he recorded that for history. Right up to 1993, there are some years with zeros, don't believe it. It's just that I had to stop somewhere. How about time of day? If you look at all the database completely, there are 470 cases in my book, but the 230 I mentioned are the ones with abstracts in them, and the others are just listed in a table. This is the 24-hour clock. This is noon. This is midnight. This is 1 minute after midnight. This is number of cases, and the lowermost curve represents the 230 cases. The uppermost curve represents the other in the table without abstracts. And what I simply want to point out is what you've already seen before, that there's a nighttime effect, that there seems to be a rather significant rise after dark, which is somewhere in here. This is local time, somewhere in here. However, there are more multiple object cases seen during daylight hours than you would expect on the basis of other statistics that have been presented. Most other databases, I won't say they exclude multiple cases, multiple objects. How do I want to say this? I don't want to step on any toes. I was surprised at the proportion of multiple object cases flying during the day. And it raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? Why, if you're going to flight test some advanced technology in formation flight, you do it during the day? Is it easier? Don't you care if you're seen? Maybe you're invincible. I mean, it doesn't matter. You're just going to go test it. That's not the way our military works. They test in pretty remote spots. How about number of witnesses? The skeptic will say, gee, that one crackpot got drunk and he went out and saw something. Well, that happens, doesn't it? In Category 1 of straight and constant flight, there were an average of 28 witnesses per case. Per case. Number 3, formations. There were 23 witnesses per case. And down here, straight flight without turns, 3 people, which I find interesting. Vertically rising up, 5, and so forth. There's a lot of people. An average of 18.2 people. I've been trying to find that 0.2 person to interview. I can't find him. Let me now turn to formations. I haven't counted the number of circles, but it's accurate. 1947, July 7th. And if you've been following the Roswell affair, that's close to an important date. And again, the book would give you all the details on where, number of witnesses, and all the details. But I want to point out this, that the arrow in each of these slides indicates direction of movement, that the phenomenon was first seen in 3 rows like this in echelon formation, and then the witness said very quickly it organized itself into a V, a chevron. Okay? Well, the good old chevrons are quite popular. And you might say, as skeptics do, that that is the traditional formation that pilots like to fly in, and it is. It's a safe flight formation because you form up on a leader and you keep only one plane in sight. So you watch out for him and your buddy watches out for you and everything's okay. This is 1951, a formation of different size lights in the night sky moving linearly across the sky. So far, kind of mundane as far as I'm concerned. There's not much information here. 6 objects, is it? 6 or 7. 1952 in May, flying in this direction, just a chevron. One of the consistent statements made by the witnesses is all of the objects look the same. Keep that in mind. This isn't a B-52 and a P-38 and so forth and so on. Almost all of them are described as single point lights, emitting lights at night or reflecting metallic objects during the daytime. Here's a formation that flies across the sky, and the witness made a point here of how evenly spaced everything was, and as they moved across there was no variation between the points like this. They were just rigid going across the sky. Here's an interesting case from 1952. We find what was described as a swarm. I think the concept of a swarm of bees or flies was used originally. And the objects are swarming as they're flying slowly, very slowly across the sky. But then they form up into a chevron. And the witness said they did so quickly and precisely. They didn't kind of jockey for position and then finally come in and settle down and then fly in a chevron. He said they just went quickly into a chevron. But then, much to his surprise, they broke into another pattern, which is 2 parallel lines, and continued that way out of sight. And once again, if you're a pilot, I hope your mind will boggle at the difficulty in doing that. I'd like to talk with you afterwards. Very, very difficult. Here's a case where a group of, 6 objects were seen in trail behind each other going across the sky. And just to fit this on the drawing, I dropped the continuation down below it here. They quickly reformatted themselves into a line abreast, like this. And then quickly, they oriented themselves vertically into a line, and it continued across the sky. So if you're into crop circles and you see the marvelous geometric precision of the crop circles, is this the same kind of statement being made by 6 objects, showing orthogonal dimensions, that they know 90-degree angles in space? I don't know. Again, a little more mundane. 4 diamonds just simply pass across the sky in rigid formation. Here's a case now where, 1954, where a lot of objects are seen flying across the night sky. And through a telescope, the amateur astronomer was able to magnify the image and see portholes. He used the word portholes, lights along the side of the larger objects. And they maintain this V formation as they go across. Here's a flight of this many objects going slowly across the sky. Again, is a triangle. A airplane approaches. I believe it was a jet. No, it wasn't a jet. It was an airplane, a small airplane. And as it gets closer and closer to the triangular shape, they reorient themselves into a U and then continue on. The report never says what happens to the airplane. I assume that it's okay. How much time do we have?
Really should try to wrap up as soon as if we want to allow any time.
Yeah, okay. Well, I can't go on without showing you this one. This is Rome, Italy. The city of Rome on a clear day. 20 objects are described in the sky coming slowly from the west
towards the center of Rome. 20 identical objects are seen coming in from the east towards the center of Rome. And there are many, many hundreds of eyewitnesses. Some very prominent people were witnesses in this case. They come to an intersection here and stop point to point and hover over Rome. And some people want to say over the Vatican. That's their words, not mine. I wasn't there. And after maintaining that cross, here marks a spot, for I believe 30 minutes with a westerly wind, there goes your balloons, then they start separating into separate lines and going apart from each other, kind of wavy lines like this. All right. Well, in summary, as I'm talking, I'll just flip these up and you can use your own imagination. In summary, the database that involves multiple objects raises far more questions than it answers, which is typical in this game, of course. The issue of energy management is central, and that's what flying airplanes is all about. I have a whole section in the book on that subject of thrust management, basically. It isn't just gravity, it's thrust management, if you're in a thrust domain. It raises questions of very advanced intelligence being put into some mechanical apparatus back in the days that we couldn't do it. And if it's classified, it still hasn't come out. Of course, that's not that unexpected. It raises questions of our ability to cope. I mean, if we're paying the Air Force to protect us from the air, by golly, they ought to be able to do some of this stuff to protect us. And I suggest that's one reason they're not talking too much about this subject, because they don't want to admit they can't protect us. Well, okay, I guess maybe I have made my point. It goes on and on. I've interviewed quite a number of these pilots involved. And these diagrams are in the book if you're interested. So why don't I stop there and then we'll just turn over to questions.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Has there been much of a correlation between the flight dynamics of these objects, especially in formation, and electromagnetic effects or other physical effects?
A little bit. I'm particularly interested in electromagnetic effects from the phenomena, and I have a number of very good cases involving lots of aircraft with compasses and radios and direction finders and intercoms and all that. And it looks to me as if there is a magnetic field, and that magnetic field varies with the inverse square of the distance, and that the compasses are affected by proximity, and it suggests that the shielding has been okay for terrestrial levels, but not for ET level, whatever the phenomenon is.
Have you found any of the microwave effects that the
That's a good question.
What's the question?
Yes, the question was, have I found any cases that involve microwave effects that Mr. McCampbell was talking about yesterday? Not specifically, although I guess I would say in terms of atmospheric contrails, condensation effects, atmospheric interchange of energy, yes, I definitely have. I have a wonderful case from South America of an airliner filled with people going over the Andes one night, and an object comes up alongside the airplane, and the closer it gets, the dimmer the cockpit lights go, the cabin lights, till everybody's practically in the dark. There's an example, I guess. Sure. Thank you. And as it goes away, the lights come back on again.
Has there been any spectroscopic analysis or
No. I know of two cases where a diffraction grating was used with cameras, on the lens of a camera with color film, and it shows continuous spectra, not a line spectra.
The anecdote of J.L. Hynek always traveled with diffraction grating and a briefcase.
Exactly. I never go anywhere without one. Yes.
Have you done overlays, like, say, with notes, molecular structures, or found any correlation with the repetition of these numbers as though they were giving a message?
No, I really haven't. The phenomenon is so transient. Now, the crop circles are a whole other issue, and if I had time, I'd talk about that. But I think that's what's going on there. The question was, have I looked at this set of data from the standpoint of molecular shapes, for instance, or some communication pattern, something like that? And the answer is no, I haven't. Not specifically. Jim?
Do you have any engine failures or radio communication failures?
In the airplane pilot database, I sure do. I have a number of very terrifying cases where one crew bails out completely in a military bomber. All the engines fail when the object's nearby. That's not in this data set, by the way. It was a single object. It was a single UFO. So I don't know if you're talking about multiple or not. Yeah.
How about radios?
Radios are failing all the time. That you either get a static, the carrier frequency effect. You might get a detuning. Well, there it is, sure. All kind of microwave effects. Thank you. Yes?
Have you seen any of the aircraft's wing cameras photographs?
I'm sorry, I missed the word.
Have you seen any of the planes often have wing cameras? Have you seen any UFOs from the wing
Gun cameras?
Yeah.
No, because the Air Force won't release them. There are, Blue Book, if you go through the files, you'll find more cases than you want to count of pilots saying, I armed my weapon system, okay, to fire a machine gun, for instance, in a pursuit situation of a UFO. Well, that arms the camera and, in fact, starts the camera just before he triggers to capture the kill, right? Well, when you look in the files for those gun camera film, they're not there. They're just gone. They're somewhere, I think. Yes?
On this effects to shut down engines and mess around with instrumentation, so on, is that still going on, or is that something that happened a long time ago and is no longer happening?
I don't know of any turbojet engines that have failed with this explanation given. That's all I can say.
But how about the time? Is it happening yet today, or is it...
Oh, no. These are reciprocating engines in the 50s. When the engines failed, it was back in the 50s that I know about. Stan, do you want to comment on that?
Just a question about, these are all visual observations. How about radar?
Oh, my. Tremendous number of cases involving onboard radar and ground radar separately, together, plus eyewitnesses at the same time. If you want solid data, it's there. There's no doubt about that. Yes?
About color, I noticed in the one from Phil and Broden that you had next to the last slide that you showed, the circle at night.
Yes.
There's a repeating sequence of colors.
Yes.
Does this imply anything to you except that it is not aircraft?
Well, let me comment on the last point first. The civil authorities in our country have agreed with the aviation authorities of the world to not use blue. It is against the law to use blue lights on an airplane. It's not good visually. The penetration distance through water, atmosphere, and so forth is just not good in the blue. So it's against the law to use blue, but a lot of the lighted objects at night have blue lights on them. So what does that mean? They're flying illegally. They're using lights they shouldn't use if it's human. That's a case, it's kind of a conjectural case that it's not human, right? But to answer your question about repeating patterns, I have not really noticed any, from a structural point of view, any repeating pattern. If anything, I think it's non-repeating.
That's suggested in that particular slide.
Yeah, yeah. And there's all variations. You can have a light source and a light source, it's red and blue, and 1 second later, they've switched. So in other words, tell me how you get a multi-source spectrum out of a single filament. I don't know how to do it. Now you can tune lasers, and maybe it's a lasing rather than incandescent process. You also have, in addition to individual sources mounted on the edge of a rigid object, but you have something like a traveling beam, a band of light that will, kind of like a spectrum, smoothly move along within a guide. I don't even know how to describe it. Well,
yeah, I can ask one question. A lot of the skeptics will say something like, well, these are really interesting stories, but they're just anecdotes, and people are unreliable observers
Sure.
and concoct stories and so forth. How do you go with that kind of comment?
Well, I point out that we live in a land that is a nation of laws that is driven by a court system and jurisprudence, where the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses can send you to the gas chamber. And if that eyewitness testimony is good enough for our court system, it ought to be good enough for us. That's what I think. The scientist says, well, I hold myself to a higher standard. What he's really saying is, I don't believe you and I don't want to accept the data. So that's a cop-out as far as I'm concerned. Yes?
Wouldn't these continuous spectrums from diffraction ratings indicate that it's not a laser? Because would not a laser give you a line?
Exactly, yes. Question is, if we have information to believe that the light in the color domain is broad spectrum, it has many wavelengths side by side, wouldn't that indicate that it's not a laser? And in general, I would have to say yes. Although they're able to put lasers side by side now so that the eye will integrate it into white, you see. So there's a bit of a conundrum there. Yes?
Dick, it's a point I didn't make yesterday, but I wonder if you'd agree with the notion that the reason we can identify most UFO sightings as relatively conventional phenomena is that people are pretty good observers. They may be lousy interpreters, but it's kind of crazy to say, well, we can believe what the observer says if it turns out to be Venus or the Goodyear blimp or an airplane. But if it's something unconventional, then we can't believe the observation. That's a contradiction in terms.
Sure. Well, don't you think this?
Analogy from yesterday.
Yes, yes. The scientists would love to be in the position of making all the final determinations. Yes?
That computerized database that you mentioned, AirCat, is that on your personal computer or
Yes.
is that out in the base?
No, it's personal. It's on an IBM 386. Yes?
How much detail is in that database? Is there enough to say to reconstruct a flight path or something?
No.
Or establish physical characteristics of something?
Yes, but not to recreate the flight path. The problem with recreating flight paths, as any air traffic controller will tell you, is that you have to have 3-dimensional radar continuously to maybe 2 or 3 second accuracy. No witness is going to have that level of precision. Obviously, they don't have depth information.
I'm just trying to establish how much detail is in the database to develop a behavioral cross-section of the different types of objects.
Yeah. Well, the purpose I put my database together for was a rapid lookup for those level of details if they are in a case. But each case has, I think, 22 fields. And that was enough for my use. If I owned a Cray computer, I would, and I had the access to the radar data tapes from the FAA, they'd all be in there. I just don't have the time or the money to do that. So, well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure being here.